Good evening. I'm Karen Taylor. I am the Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. And it is a great pleasure to welcome you here all this evening. This is the final Labour lecture for this season. The Labour lecture is part of the Labour Literature and Landmark Lecture Series. Our lectures are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. We're pleased to present this lecture with the New York Landmark Conservancy and thank them for their promotional support of this event and welcome their members here this evening. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The Society was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of the City of New York. Now, 230 years later, the Society continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the city through our educational and cultural programs. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, the library, of which of course you're in this evening, and our nearly 200-old lecture series. So these lectures are part of an important legacy. You will also find actually you won't tonight, but normally you would find an informational postcard on your seat, but you will find it on the front table, and you will also, if you're interested in finding more about our library, you will also find that on the front registration table. This season's Labour Lectures explores different aspects of the urban infrastructure and urban environment of the city. And for our program tonight, the anthropologist Robin Nagle will be discussing her book, Picking Up, and her experiences inside New York City's Department of Sanitation, a largely unseen and often unloved army responsible for keeping the city clean, healthy, and alive. To learn the job firsthand, she was hired as a sanitation worker herself. So while loading out trucks and plowing snow, she experienced firsthand the physical aches, the public abuse, and surprising hazards that are always part of the work. Her insider's perspective reveals the startling complexity and rich camaraderie of a mostly invisible world. It is now my huge pleasure to introduce to you Robin Nagle. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you, Karen. I am so honored to be in this space in particular. It's one of the most spectacular and historically significant spaces in the city, as you all know. I want to thank specifically Karen Taylor for many email back and forths to get the details in place. I want to thank also Victoria Dengel, the executive director, for extending the invitation. Dash Leah is one of our tech people, as is, I don't want to mess up her name, Melena Rogers. I thank them for helping this, the technical part happen. Without the pictures, I don't have a talk, so this is very important. John, I'm going to mess up your name. John Rokosny is on the video. And at the end of my talk, I hope you are inspired to buy every single book on the back table, and Guy Anglade will be happy to sell them to you. So with that, I'm going to start. Karen talked about how I'm going to talk about the book. And the book itself, I hope, stands on its own. But of course, there's a whole lot of material that can't fit in a book. So what I'm going to give you tonight are the pieces that you won't find inside the covers, but that I had to come to understand in great detail to write the book in the first place. If the book held all the stories I wanted, it would be thousands of pages long. It wouldn't be finished. It would be one of those Sisyphusian labors that would be ultimately useless. So I'm going to frame my presentation tonight around these three questions. What systems allow a city to thrive? Whose history matters? And what counts as cultural heritage according to whom? And I hope you'll see why these are the organizing questions around not just this evening's talk, but also the theme that is shot through the book. why it's important to know what sanitation workers do, who they are, what the labor requires, and how profoundly dependent we are on them for our everyday and historic well-being. So I'm going to start with the fact that is very true in New York City, but also in great cities the world over. We walk on our history every day. We're going to zoom in here. That's the eastern seaboard of New York. Of course, this is the 5 boroughs of the city. If I go too fast, please raise your hand. I won't know that I'm doing that unless you tell me. We're going to zoom in here to Lower Manhattan. This is the way the island looked more or less when Henry Hudson arrived in 1609. And at that time, it was a far smaller piece of geography than what we're used to now. By the time the Dutch had settled in the 1620s, 30s, 40s, by 1657, Peter Stuyvesant established what were really the city's first solid waste zoning rules, and he told New Amsterdammers they were allowed to deposit their garbage in one of 5 locations. This pin is one of those. It was originally the corner, today it is the corner of Bridge and Broad Street, and I'll explain this web that's on top of the map in just a moment. This is what is today Pearl Street and Wall Street. This is Pearl and Whitehall. You'll notice these pins are all on the edges of the island. This is Pearl Street and Coenties Slip. Now keep that pin in mind. There's the same pin. All of the land that now supports this network of streets and highways, that's the web on top of this map. All of that is built on fill, much of which was considered garbage, waste, discards, back in the colonial era. This gives you a little bit of a better sense of how profoundly we filled in the lower part of the island, but really most of the waterways and marshes that were native to Manhattan. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but I want you to consider with the question of cultural heritage, when we build in spaces in Lower Manhattan today, by law, an archaeologist must accompany the project to make sure that artifacts from hundreds of years ago are not lost. But hundreds of years ago, those artifacts weren't artifacts, they were trash. So when does a piece of rubbish transform into a piece of important history? We're going to jump ahead 200 years to the second half of the 19th century. This is a quote, the misspelling was in the newspaper account of what New York City was like at that moment. We were famously corrupt, as some of you may know, and as a consequence, we were also famously dirty. Other grand cities had already figured out how to clean themselves, but the politicians in New York in this era said that New York was too diverse and too crowded, and it couldn't really be done. We dumped an awful lot of garbage in our own harbors. I'll get back to this particular, you see the horse hooves in the corner here. We actually clogged our own shipping channels several times in the 1880s, which is the transportation and commercial equivalent of burying I-95 or the Major Deegan in trash so that you can't come in or go out of the city and you can't get goods in or out of the city. This political cartoon is rather prescient. The idea is that the poor could use garbage as a source of fuel for heat and for energy. But of course, we do that all over the world now. If you live in Manhattan, your household waste goes to one of 2 waste-to-energy facilities in New Jersey. So your garbage is doing this, turning into energy that is then sold back to the community. Again, only if you're in Manhattan. Well, never mind, I'm not going to get into where all of your different garbage goes, although we can talk about that later. The political cartoons in this moment were especially important forms of communication because the city was already full of people of many different languages, but literacy in any of them was not particularly high. But you can figure out what these cartoons are saying, even if you don't necessarily know the words on them. And in fact, it was the most vulnerable New Yorkers who were paying the price for a corrupt government. This was Tammany Hall, taking money designated for street cleaning, but instead of actually cleaning the streets, putting it into the pockets of local politicians and leaving the streets, particularly in the poor neighborhoods, unimaginably filthy. This also became a time for wealthy New Yorkers to visit the poorer quarters where the ragged people lived as a kind of early exploitative ecotourism kind of thing. The women on the this side of the image are holding violet water scented handkerchiefs to their nose, while this man is actually earning his living by scavenging from the city's wastes. He will then sell these goods and feed his family. This is near what is today West Broadway. Horses became basically the engine of New York, but also a source of a very real problem in the streets when they dropped dead, as they often did. This is a series of photographs taken in 1893 throughout New York. When I say throughout New York, it's mostly the lower part of what is today downtown. But this is how the streets looked for as long as anyone could remember. There was not a clean curb line or cobblestones showing through for decades. The corruption that had the city in its lock for decades was finally broken briefly in 1894, and a mayor named Strong was elected. He made two key appointments. He reached out to Theodore Roosevelt and said, "Teddy, my man, would you be the commissioner of the Department of Street Cleaning?" And Teddy Roosevelt said, "What, are you nuts? That can't be done." So Teddy got the police department, which was in its own crisis at that time, and this man was given the Department of Street Cleaning. Waring was a Civil War veteran, a showman, a self-styled sanitary engineer, and he had one condition under which he took the job. He said to the mayor, "I'll do this if you let me do it my way. I want no interference," because prior to this one brief moment of reform, the mayor told all of his commissioners whom they would hire and fire and when and where and why. Mayor Strong said to Waring, "Okay, I give you this. If you screw up, I'm firing you." And Waring said, "Yes, of course, but otherwise you leave me alone." He started in 5 points. I don't have photographs of the before and after, but this is what it looked like in only 5 months after he was in office. So he started in January of 1895, and by May and June of 1895, the most egregious examples of the city's grime and slime and festering filth had been cleaned up. It was not something anyone had predicted. In fact, quite the opposite. He was told that he would fail. The key to his success was a few initiatives he put in place that, in fact, are still part of the Department of Sanitation, which evolved from the Department of Street Cleaning. This is a cartoon that basically crystallizes the work relationship before Waring. You can't really read the caption very easily, but the fellow in the middle is a newcomer to the Department of Street Cleaning, and the old-timers on either side of him are counseling him how to do the job, and their advice is, "Sonny, don't sweep today what you could wait and sweep tomorrow." Needless to say, it was not an effective way of cleaning the streets. He transformed that kind of workforce into this. He put the men in white uniforms for 3 reasons. White, even back then, was already associated with medical authority. He gave them the helmets, the same helmets that police wear today, and there was a third reason for the white uniforms. His wife, by the way, told him he was crazy, and when I mention this detail about the city's history, I also offer anyone who is hearing me the suggestion that someone had to clean those uniforms. The research on that labor has not yet been done, and I think it's a fascinating research question, so I invite you to take it up. But the third reason to have a white uniform is that you can't sneak off to the pub for a pint when you're dressed like that. So there was a surveillance element to it as well. This is a little out of order. I'm gonna play it anyway. If you want to see accounts of the city from the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s, Thomas Edison has a series of small films like this from all over New York, doing very humble, mundane things. This one in particular shows how once the waste was in a cart, it was taken to the piers and then dumped into a scow. There are people, obviously, on the scow working. They are mostly, at this time, Italians. The people in the carts are mostly, at this time, Irish. That has to do with the history of immigration in the city. That's a separate talk. But I would encourage you to remember that there are no worker safety protocols here. This is labor done at great risk and no doubt at great cost to the health and well-being of the people on those scows. The men who work on the boats are called scow trimmers. Those of you with any knowledge of sort of nautical, how it works to have a boat with a load, it has to be balanced before you can take it out to sea. So they were trimming the boat so that it would they could also keep what they found. And in fact, they made, I'm not going to say a handsome living, but they survived based on what they could pull off of the scows and then sell. Or used to feed their families. Fascinating moments in the city's history then about how Italians were or were not inherently racially suited to this work. That, again, that's sort of a separate talk. But moving forward, the white uniform prevailed for a few decades. This is in the 1920s. It even became a kind of a cultural icon, so that Charlie Chaplin takes a turn as what came to be called a white wing, the nickname of the street cleaners in New York, in the film City Lights. 3 on a Match was a film made the following year where also the Department of Street Cleaning plays a prominent role. And I'll tell you, I haven't seen 3 on a Match, but City Lights, he gets the details exactly right. So if you want to see what it was like to be a street sweeper in New York in 1931, I highly commend you to City Lights. It's a little hard to exaggerate the cultural size of the heroism accorded to the white wings. It would be as if Beyonce or Taylor Swift were doing top of the charts music videos about sanitation workers in New York City. A little hard maybe to wrap your head around now, but 100 years ago, where are we, 2000? Yes, 100 years ago, they were the heroes of the city for the profound transformation that they had made in the streets of New York. The uniform changed. This is from around the 50s. They still have the hats like what the cops in that era wore. And it changed again. This is when I was hired into sanitation, this was my class. This was when we went to take our oath of loyalty to the city. This is a more recent class. This is from last year. I give talks about the history of the department to new hires. Those of you with a photographic memory, memorize this and you'll dazzle and amaze your friends at these little factoids about the specifics of the department in terms of equipment and workers and whatnot. Just so you know, the Department of Sanitation has 59 sanitation districts. These are, the technical term is coterminous with community board districts. So if you know what community board you live in, that's the same sanitation district you live in. Unlike the 5-borough divisions in the city, sanitation has a 7-borough command. Queens is divided into east and west, and Brooklyn is divided into north and south. So if anyone starts talking about the 7 boroughs of New York, they might be a sanitation person. These are just quick images of the standard equipment. You'll notice the side guard here. This is a recent innovation that Mayor de Blasio has asked for to enhance the safety of, where's my little button? Civilians and small dogs and children who are therefore far less likely to be pulled under the wheels of the truck. In terms of public safety, municipal sanitation workers have one of the best safety records in the entire industry. Private carters, that's a different story, for very real reasons, and I'm not casting aspersions on the privates, but the rhythms of their work are a little different. If you take away nothing else from tonight, there are 2 things I want you to take away. One of them is the name of this. This is not a broom truck. This is a mechanical broom. That's what it's called. And it's quite a contraption. I was trained in, you don't drive this, you operate it. This is called the gutter broom. There's a pickup broom you can barely see that's under there. It's like a big lint roller. I discuss this in the book. It is a kick to operate these things. It's like you're in an airplane that's about 6 feet off the ground, moving at a top speed of 35 miles an hour, but with this phalanx of dials and knobs and gauges, and mastering all of that, the subtlety of that is its own skill. I wasn't on the job long enough to become a real master of the broom, but it's impressive to see people who are. This move, for example, I never got right. Every time I backed up my broom to a truck, which is how you dump when you're in the field and going back to the actual dump would take too long, I missed over and over and over and over. This is just a kind kind of the cavalry of brooms waiting to go out into the world. This is one of our automated trucks. It takes only one worker as opposed to the standard collection truck, which uses 2 workers. This is called an easy pack. The arms come down, they slide into the side of the container, then they go up to the roof of the truck and are dropped in to the vehicle that way. The only woman killed on the job was killed by one of these. Her partner didn't know she had gone to the roof of the truck to clear some debris. And I'll talk in a little bit about the dangers of the job. This is called a cut down. I think it's more colloquially known as just a dump truck. When you come on the job as a sanitation worker, you're trained in how to drive the truck. You have to have a commercial driver's license. But when you go to take your road test, supposedly the DMV examiners don't want to ride around in a garbage truck. So you take your road test in one of these. If I could have spoken for the first 10 minutes of my own road test when I was so nervous, I probably would have had a higher score because you're supposed to call out things as you go, but I couldn't speak. Anyway, don't worry, I passed. I was not allowed onto the roads without having passed the road test. This is just collection, and then the difference of it with recycling. If you live in a neighborhood that also has organics collection, meaning food waste, you may have as many as 4 trucks going down your block on a given week. You have garbage, paper, plastic, metal, and glass, and then food waste, which we can talk about that. That's a lot of trucks. I'm going to segue now into a description of essential roles that sanitation plays in the city that you probably don't know about. And this is not in the book, so this is the extra, right? Wow, there's been a lot of extra, but here's some more. Disaster response is a primary responsibility for the Department of Sanitation. This is not something you would normally assume it to be. It's a garbage department. What do you have to do with disasters? When these were hit, when these fell, the people who worked at the time at Fresh Kills, and I'll talk about that in a minute, they knew immediately that there was nowhere else in the city where the material could go that would be safe, that was city-owned, that was big enough. And sanitation, heavy equipment, and expert operators and managers were on the scene in downtown Manhattan that afternoon. They had to stage the equipment across the Verrazano Bridge and then across other bridges to get it into Manhattan, because if they put too much of it on those bridges at once, the bridges would have collapsed. So just moving equipment that was never intended to be on the streets was itself a very interesting challenge. Initially, the material was moved by truck, but that was quickly obvious that that was inefficient and that there were too many opportunities for graft, remarkably. So it was the barges that had been part of sanitation's operations for decades were pulled back into service. Fresh Kills Landfill had closed the previous March, so it was 5 months earlier, but we hadn't sold off the barges yet. One of the interesting challenges in the very early days after September 11th was sanitation people teaching the commissioners and managers from other city agencies exactly how that barge system had to work. So that, for example, you could not, sanitation refused to follow the order of other city officials who said, bring all 80 barges here to Lower Manhattan, and then we'll fill them up and we'll send them to Fresh Kills. And sanitation had to teach their colleagues, you need to divide it into 3. So you have 3 being loaded, you have 3 in transit, 3 chunks. So you have a third being loaded, a third in transit, and a third being offloaded. That's a simple thing, but if you haven't worked in a field that requires moving massive amounts of material efficiently for decades, you wouldn't necessarily know that. The evolution of the work at Fresh Kills, this is about 3 weeks in, it became, the nickname among some was a city on a hill. It became a very specialized and very complex set of operations. It's important to keep in mind that every person who worked there lost someone in the attacks. And when there are charges that the work searching through the debris, the material, that work was done in any way that was sloppy or casual or without due care, the people doing that work take great umbrage at that. This was deeply personal to them, as you probably are not surprised to hear that. A more recent disaster is Hurricane Sandy. We're going to go back to the map just briefly. You see how New Jersey and the South Shore of Long Island form what is a perfect right angle. This is called the New York Bight, B-I-G-H-T, which just means a bend in a shoreline. But what that does in some contexts is funnel a storm up into the New York harbor. And the comparison I make is, imagine you're in a car and you're revving the engine higher and higher, but you're not moving. But the ferocity, the RPMs are getting greater and greater. Sanitation was the first agency on the streets after the storm, despite the fact that many of the people who were working 14-hour days, 7-day weeks, themselves had lost their homes. There was one chief in eastern Queens whose home had been reduced to kindling, and he couldn't tend to that at all until after he had helped clean up the city. We are, of course, in an era of profound technological sophistication, but setting up those systems takes time. This is how the truck assignments were organized for the eastern part of Queens in the week or so immediately after the storm. So this is dry erase markers on a dry erase board, and it worked. After most of the storm was cleared, this illustration was done by a sanitation worker who's also an instructor, and my favorite part of this picture is that the worker himself is not a young man. The St. Patrick's Day parade season, you may know, kicks off in the Rockaways every March, the first Saturday. If you are into St. Patrick's Day parades, this is where you must go. Sanitation has participated every year, but this was new. There were people with signs like this all up and down the route, and I was walking with them that year, and they're tough men and women, but they had tears in their eyes by the end because of this kind of outpouring. So I talked at the very start about whose cultural heritage matters. So what is the legacy of people whose work it is to clean up after us all day, every day? The connection of medical authority and public health that George Waring made with the white uniforms carries forward. This is the Department of Sanitation headquarters at 125 Worth Street. The building was built in 1935. It's gorgeous, by the way. It's one of those lovely WPA efforts that has the kind of details we just don't bother with anymore. But you see the connection of health, hospitals, and sanitation. But it's not all work. This was the sanitation marching band. It was a brass band. Supposedly when the very charismatic director of the band, I think he died. I don't think he just retired and left. I think he actually died. And no one could carry it forward without him. So they tossed all of the instruments into a storage room in a sanitation facility in Queens. And guess what happened many years later? What does sanitation do best? They throw things out. It breaks my heart, that particular story. But we have a band again today. We have a pipe and drum band, an award-winning band that has been going strong now for 22 years. For about 15 years in the 50s and 60s, there was a fantastic little quarterly magazine that served the department called Sweep. It's not just charming, it's also a source of pretty interesting historical detail. For example, when did we make the switch from trash cans to plastic bags? Well, in fact, it was in the summer of 1969. And this is the issue in which they are celebrating. At this point, they're actually large paper bags that are lined with plastic. But then by 1971, we have John Lindsay, Joel Kretschmer, and John DeLury. So that's Lindsay, that's Kretschmer, and that's John DeLury, the president of the Sanitation Workers Union, heralding this vast improvement, which I will tell you, and this is a different talk that I give, but it's worth mentioning here. This was the moment when New York City became rat utopia. Just saying. Some of the lovely community building kinds of things that Sweep included were these sorts of details. Can you match the face of the son with the face of the father? It is a legacy job, just like police and fire are. These guys, you might guess, are related. The ticker tape parade cleanups, if you want to know who's going to win, if it's about an election or any kind of contest, look at the tonnage of debris picked up by the department after a special event, and that will be a very accurate prediction. This one was from the 80s. This one is from one of the Super Bowls, the Giants Super Bowl, I think, against New England. And this is from Times Square, from the New Year's Eve cleanup from 2014. If there's any special event going on in the city, we're there. For example, during Passover in the Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods, as you may know, anything that had any contact with anything leavened during the year has to be burned. So what you can't quite see here, there's a sanitation truck from the other angle. We're there. So one of the many privileges of working with the department has been coming to know some of the rhythms of neighborhoods that I might not otherwise spend time in as I accompany crews doing their work. It was a three-man job, and I say men very deliberately. As of 1986, women were admitted to the uniformed ranks. The central repair shop in Queens, and this will be on the Open House New York tour schedule again this year. If any of you would like to walk through this, keep your eyes peeled for that announcement. It is as long as the Chrysler Building is tall. It employs 1,000 people in everything from upholstery and carpentry to plumbers and electricians. Every vehicle in the department and every facility in the department, this is the responsibility. This part of the department has responsibility for that. And it's pretty significant. So what happens when our garbage flow doesn't flow? What happens when the waste we generate stops, stutters, backs up? It happens at every big snowfall, of course. New Yorkers don't stop creating trash just because the workforce dedicated to picking it up is now dedicated to removing snow. We will make garbage all the time, no matter what. And then after the snow is clear, the workforce goes after what's called chasing garbage. There is a glossary, a 10-page glossary at the back of my book about how to talk sanitation. So if you want to learn some of the lingo and then amaze and delight the sanitation workers in your neighborhood, I encourage you. This is called a snow cone in sanitation slang. This is a relatively new initiative. This is the Public Space Recycling Initiative. I would say we need a little more public education to make this work the way it's supposed to. I take my students a couple of times a year out on a tour with freegans. This is a fascinating way to interrupt the flow of waste. Freegans, does anyone know what freegans are about? So freegans are people who try and live off the economic grid as much as possible, which means they will barter when they can and trade. They also, some of them will find food in the trash, which is not as bad as it sounds. So this is a group of students I took out last fall, and the flow we are interrupting here is from a very high-end bakery that does not sell day-old baked goods. So this is going into the back of a collection, not a city truck, this will go in a private truck. But my students took this home and had really good food for free for quite a while. I did falsely advertise how they would get the food, but that's another story. Free food for life did not include the phrase dumpster diving. But they were good sports. Anyway, another way in which the flow is interrupted, this is a relatively recent project I've taken up with sanitation, is a collection of found treasures in a sanitation garage in East Harlem. Some of you may have seen some press about this. Nelson Molina was a sanitation worker for 34 years, and across that time he pulled out of the trash things he felt shouldn't be in the trash, and he kept them. And he now has tens of thousands of objects beautifully curated. They're not just all in a room. They're put together in a way that touches the spirit. This is Nelson in the yellow. This is our first Open House New York tour. Or no, that might not be Open House New York. I can't remember. But this will also be on the Open House schedule this year, as well as some other tours that we're running at the end of July and through August. I'm the contact for that, and I'm not as well organized as I should be, so if you reach out to me wanting more information and I'm slow to get back to you, I pre-apologize, but I will get to you. This is during the sanitation strike of 1968. Some of you were here then, you remember this vividly, the stories I hear from New Yorkers. This is all about how the flow stops and then what happens when it backs up. This is simply derelict vehicles. Sanitation was tasked, as they say, with this chore in the early 1980s. And these next few images are from other parts of the world. This is in Naples, Italy in 2010. This is in Toronto in 2009. I always get that reaction. It's such a great image. This is actually the work of an Italian artist named Moreno di Trapani in reaction to the Naples problem. So again, when the flow stops, even briefly, but especially if it stops in a long-term way, we are put at great risk. And I don't just mean inconvenienced. I mean in terms of public health and basic well-being, beyond the sort of quality of life measure. I'm talking like survival. We're going to go through this quickly. This little knob of land here is called Dead Horse Bay. You may recall the slide earlier on of the debris dumped in the harbor with the horse hooves sticking out. In 1859, the city settled rendering facilities way out here. It wasn't even yet part of the city proper, but it was far enough away from any civilized neighborhoods or populated neighborhoods that the smell would only inconvenience a few. This is the same place. It's now been quite filled in. This is Jamaica Bay in Brooklyn. You see, I like maps. This is the same, Google Earth. And I'm showing you this because this was a landfill in various measures from the 1850s until the last load was dumped in March of 1953, but it wasn't capped. It wasn't sealed. So it's been reasserting itself into the world ever since. There's a horse bone left over from the olden days. But if you want to understand what's there, imagine at the top layer, the most prominent layer, imagine an apartment of let's say someone who works on the docks in Brooklyn in 1953, and you're the props master for the film, let's say, about that family. Populate the home with every object that might have been in the home at the time. That's what's on the beach at Dead Horse Bay. So this is flow that went to an endpoint that was supposed to be appropriate, but that is now reasserting itself into the world. This is obvious, it's a shoe, but can you recognize what this is? Mike, say it again. An iron? Yes, a clothing iron. Of a very nifty style, I might say. I like this sort of. And then this is just a collection of things that some students gathered when I went out there with them last year. These are subsets of, I give whole talks just about each of these subsets, so I apologize for not going into more detail about this, but I do want to leave time for a conversation. When I showed you the video of the guys on the scows with the carts dumping on their heads, okay? Even back then, sanitation was an extremely dangerous job. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it is still, and pretty much every year is, one of the 10 most dangerous jobs in the country, far more dangerous than being a cop or a firefighter. And I say that meaning no disrespect or lack of love for my cousins on the police department and the fire department. These two trucks they were in separate accidents. The drivers did not survive. This is a man who was killed in 2010. The funeral draws the sea of officers in their Class A's, green, not blue, but it does not draw the press. It does not draw the 3-inch headlines. It does not draw the television crews coming to reveal the tragedy. But I feel rather strongly if someone I know is killed in the line of duty serving the city, they deserve no less than what a police officer or a firefighter gets in terms of the outpouring of support and love from the public. Sanitation does have something quite unique, well, many things quite unique, but one of them is since the early 1980s, they have had an artist-in-residence. Meryl Latterman-Euclides has held that role ever since. Her first work was called Touch Sanitation, in which she visited every single sanitation facility in the entire city and shook hands with every sanitation worker. This is one of her sculptural pieces. It's called Social Mirror. The idea is that when we see ourselves reflected in the side of the truck, we might remember that we actually created what's inside the truck. This is a more recent picture of Meryl. When she did Touch Sanitation, this is what she said to every sanitation worker whose hand she shook. It's not just thank you for keeping the city clean. It is thank you for keeping the city alive. And I'm going to make a plug for her. The Queens Museum, for the first time ever, is doing a retrospective that is the entire museum about one artist, and it's Meryl, and it opens this September through next February. So I highly encourage you to look up the schedule, see what's going on, and go sit at her feet. She is a revolutionary and a visionary and an amazing person. This is me doing field work. On September 12th, 2001, I heard the sound of the sanitation truck on the street below my apartment. And I was astonished that a garbage truck was on its route, same as ever, the day after September 11th. So I grabbed my son, who was a toddler at the time, and I ran downstairs, and I met this man doing paper recycling. He was on his paper route, not the same as throwing the papers onto the porch. And I tried to thank him for his work on that day of all days, and I couldn't speak. And he just looked at me and he said, "We're going to be okay." So that was September 2001. Fast forward about a year, and I finally have permission to start field work with sanitation. I tell that story in the book, so I won't bore you with it now, but it took 2 years for them to even meet with me. I'm glad I'm stubborn. I was assigned to the garage where I knew this fellow worked, and so I started asking around to find out if I might actually meet him again. And when I finally found him, I said, "You came to my block on September 12th. And he looked at me and said, "You were the lady with the baby. And when I got back to the garage, I told everybody at the garage all about you." And we had a big hug, and I worked with Polly Ingram many times when I first started field work. We became buddies. So what endures? What is the cultural heritage of our profligate waste generation habits? Freshkill's landfill was once the largest built structure in the history of humankind, the largest landfill in the history of humankind, millions and millions of tons of household waste. It is now becoming one of the most extraordinary and environmentally forward-thinking parks in the world. It took 50 years to build it as a landfill. It will take about 50 years for it to become a full park, but there are already moments when you can take tours, when you can enjoy it in some of the parts that are either permanently or intermittently open to the public. The methane retrieval candy cane pipes like this will not be there forever. This looks like the kind of collection of, in sanitation lingo, you call them body bags outside of a large apartment building. But if you look closely, they were turned into art by some, I don't know who had these absolutely beautiful, this one in particular is quite true. There's even a contemporary political note in the legacy of sanitation in the city. This was Ferry Point Landfill in 1956, which is now the Trump National Golf Course. I don't know if any of you are fans of The Simpsons. I highly encourage you to watch an episode called Trash of the Titans, when Homer becomes sanitation commissioner, and you will find out what's going to happen to this pretty soon. We're going to go back to this map of Lower Manhattan. I want you to focus here on this body of water called the Freshwater Pond, and that pin is here is this. So the freshwater pond was filled between 1803 and 1811, and is now the home of the Department of Sanitation headquarters, which I think is a lovely irony. The fill, people forgot that it had been filled, and when the the Lexington Avenue line was being built, the engineers had it all worked out, and then they got to this glunk, muck, bleh, that was the fill of the freshwater pond, and they had to stop and reconfigure and re-engineer everything to get through that was the fill of the freshwater pond. 2 more slides. This is from Sweet Magazine, and it, to me, crystallizes the fundamental problem of garbage. I've been up here, I have a perpetually drippy nose, and I have my little Kleenex. Well, when I'm done with this Kleenex, I'm done with this Kleenex. And if you come to me and say, "Oh, is that your Kleenex?" Not anymore. I'm done with it. Well, okay, if we're allowed to live that way, who picks it up? What happens next? I litter this on the ground, and then what happens? There has to be a person and a structure and a system in place for the then what happens. And just to give you a certain profound unease about priorities and where we focus our energy, this is the last slide of my talk. We do focus an awful lot of attention on curbside recycling, which is extremely important, but I would urge you to think about scale and think about the forms of waste and discard that we don't see on our curbs every day. And I invite you to join me in brainstorming how do we put this set of facts on a political agenda so that we will begin to actually address the much bigger portion of waste that is part of our legacy. And with that, I'm done talking the formal way. And it's time to take questions and comments from you all. Thank you for being such a good audience. And if I could ask you to wait until the mic comes to you before you speak, because this is being recorded and it needs to be inside the John's video system.
Incredibly, within the last week, I think I saw 2 articles on trash. One was in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and it was about separating out the plastic bags. I'm guessing you saw them. And one article talked about, in trash speak, the high value of white paper, and that they would shoot it with beams and they could tell based on how much light went through the garbage where the white paper was and separate that out. And I just thought, it's 2016, like, didn't we approach this in the 1970s? They said if office buildings did a better job of separating out their white paper, we'd be so far ahead. And it was disturbing that we're at where we're at. And
I concur, absolutely. One of the challenges for commercial recycling is enforcement. The laws are in place. The enforcement muscle mostly isn't, and that's in part about resource allocation. Where are you putting the funds and the people to enforce the laws? The New York City Department of Sanitation, and I sometimes forget to make this clear, is responsible for household waste only and some nonprofits. Commercial waste of all forms is the responsibility of private carters, of which there are approximately 200 who serve the city. For them to comply with recycling laws, they would need to partner with the city to build facilities that can separate, or that can take the separated material. There are 2 primary ways to make recycling work. One is called source separation. That means where it comes from, we separate it. So in an office building, you would have a rigorous compliance with the white paper all goes here and the plastic bottles all go there. And then you'd have the building staff that would also be in compliance. And then you would have the carter also have separate trucks or separate bins to keep that from being, the different commodities, they're called, from becoming contaminated. All of that requires an infrastructure that kind of isn't in place. And you're right, it should be. We have been working on this for a while. But that infrastructure is generally a tremendous cost. So source separation, the other problem with source separation is that we don't do it very well. We mess it up a lot. We put the coffee grounds in with the cardboard. We put the whatever else in with whatever else. And once you have even a little bit of the wrong thing in the otherwise recyclable material, it's contaminated and you're done. The other way to do it is called single stream, where you take all the recyclables to the sorting facility, and then through a variety of both human hands and eyes on, and also a very complex set of bells and whistles. It's sort of a Rube Goldberg-looking contraption that fills an entire building. Then it's separated that way, which tends to be more accurate, but also has more, there's loss in that system as well. And let me just add, if any of you are interested in seeing a really fascinating state-of-the-art recycling facility, Sims Metals Management in Brooklyn offers tours all the time. If you go on their website and you click the contact us for a tour link or whatever it is, they'll set you up. And I highly recommend it. It's worth a trip out to, they say Sunset Park, but it's at like 29th and Hamilton Avenue in Brooklyn. Sort of Red Hook-ish. Anyway, yes, who's next? Oh.
Follow-up. Are they better at this in Europe than we are?
Yes.
Yeah.
Also in Japan.
Thank you. I already bought the book. It was a wonderful presentation. Before I ask my question, one of my favorite sentences is we have an apartment up on Columbus Avenue, and they'd have the Columbus Avenue Fair. It's granddaddy of all the fairs. Great day.
It is a good fair.
But at sundown, there was a foot of garbage for 14 blocks. And then about 11 o'clock at night, an army of man and machine would just march out like on some kind of cartoon. In a matter of hours, it was this, and I salute them as they went by. It was a marvel to watch.
One of the privileges of hanging out with sanitation is to be part of some of the cleanups for special events, like the New Year's Eve ball drop at Times Square. And it is coordinated with military precision. There's a team that comes from the south and a team that comes from the north, and they know exactly how many pieces of equipment, how much labor power, how many hours it's going to take, how many tons they'll probably get. And by the end of that shift, I'm going to use a cliche, it looks like you could eat off the curb. In fact,
Yes.
it will not look that clean
Correct.
again until
Correct.
after the next New Year's Eve.
My question is, recently we've had to leave the city. We moved to Florida, and okay, I'm back, right? I found out since I've left here that most of the country has privatized
Yes.
sanitation.
Yes.
And what is your research or thoughts on that?
Much of the country has privatized sanitation, and much of the country has also automated sanitation so that instead of 2 people in a truck, you have 1 person in a truck. I showed you a picture of the Easy Pack that is our automated collection truck. In more suburban kinds of cities, you have a sidearm that goes out and then picks up the plastic barrel and puts it in the side of the truck. That could work in New York, in some neighborhoods in Staten Island and Eastern Queens. But I love the image of a sidearm on the Upper West Side, let's say, and it goes ka-thunk through the roof of the car and then through and then picks up the entire Volkswagen and it would be, Charlie Chaplin it would be a great thing to see as comedy. In terms of privatization, yes, there are fewer and fewer cities that have municipal sanitation workers. New York's has long been the oldest and largest, and also the only one that does snow, as well as street sweeping, that's the mechanical brooms, and garbage collection. Rudy Giuliani told the department in the early 90s, figure out how to privatize. So they started to work on it, and the private stepped forward and said, well, okay, we could do district by district or parts of the borough by parts of the borough, but we can't do snow. And so the city said, yeah, well, too bad. And from my perspective, thank goodness. The question of privatization, in my research for the book, and I talk about this in some of the history chapters, I wanted to know when has it been private, and when has it been public, and why has it switched back and forth. And in fact, since before Peter Stuyvesant's time, it was public. And that didn't work very well, so they made it private. And that really didn't work very well. So they made it public. And then there were problems, so they made it private. We, as the city, we have gone back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. There are many policies in place that are vigorously enforced that they don't prevent any form of corruption 100%, because that's kind of impossible. But it is far more likely that the way the city system is structured now, you are not going to have mobbed up sanitation cartels, that you are not going to have people on the take, that you are not going to have the kinds of almost cartoonish, stereotypical corruption that can happen on the private side. And I am not saying that the 200 private carters who serve New York City are all mobbed up or corrupt. However, there are also philosophical reasons that I would hate to see it go private. They know a lot about us. When a sanitation worker works a given route for a long time, they can tell you very intimate details about the people living on that street. They don't particularly care. They're not out there to learn the details about, well, you just got divorced, or you quit drinking for a long time and you started again, but they know those things. I don't want privates to know. Yeah. But then there are the union issues. And then there's the fact that sanitation is one of the few jobs that you can have in New York City today that requires only a high school diploma, where you can earn a living well enough to buy a home, to put your kids through college, to have the kind of solid middle-class life that used to be the American dream, and that now is farther and farther out of reach for so many people. You only need a high school diploma, or its equivalent, but I will tell you, some of the most creative, intelligent, just rock-solid, smartest people I've ever worked with happen to work for the Department of Sanitation. So don't assume, well, they only have high school diploma. Many have education far beyond that, but even those who only went through high school, there's some kick-ass smart people out there serving us through the Department of Sanitation. And if I sound like an advocate for them, yes, I am. Anyway, so I can talk at length about privatization, but that's just some thoughts. Hold on just a second. His mic is not on.
Thank you for your talk. Which recyclable items between glass and metal and paper actually are revenue positive in New York City?
Paper.
And which ones lose money for New York City?
Everything else. We pay to have plastics, metal, glass, and organics taken away. Paper earns us money, but that's all. Everything else costs us money. And in fact, there was in the early years of the Bloomberg administration, when he realized that we were losing money on recycling, he said, yeah, well, that doesn't really make sense. Let's just suspend it. And I appreciate the economic reasons for that. We have not yet returned to the level of recycling participation since that was cut and then a few years later restored, that we had between 1989, when curbside recycling was first mandatory in New York, and 2003 or 4, whenever it was suspended. So, but the economics of it, that's not yet the reason we're doing it.
Oh, yeah, and a ballpark loss each year for New York City?
That I don't know. I don't know off the top of my head. But if you give me your contact information afterwards, I can get that to you.
Okay, thank you.
No, but then it won't be part of the video thing, sorry.
So, given how important sanitation is to health, what's the current state of the rat situation in New York City?
Well, I would suggest to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen a speaker named Robert Corrigan. I'm Dr. Garbage, he's Dr. Rat. He is one of the world's most well-respected rodentologists and pest control managers, and he gives a fascinating talk about rats. The idea that what are some of the cliches about rats? There's 1 million for every one of us, or there's one for each of us, or you're never more than 3 feet away from a rat. All of that is untrue. They're not that many. The problem, however, in New York is that as long as we put out our trash in plastic bags, we are providing infinite bounty for rats. So until we decide to either reclaim metal containers of some kind or come up with some other alternative that is rat-proof, we're going to have rats. Rats can get through. The only thing they cannot get through is metal. So if they can get through concrete, they can get through, well, I guess glass they can't get through. But they are amazing creatures. And until I knew Corrigan, they wigged me out. But then I knew Corrigan, and I've heard several of his talks, and now my son and I will be waiting for a train, and we'll see a rat on the track, and we'll immediately start to speculate, oh, that looks like a young juvenile. Why, yes, the coat is so healthy. I don't think she or he has been in any fights yet. Oh, or, oh my, that's an old one. Look, it's all scarred. So they are our neighbors and cousins, and here, we got them. And if we put our garbage out in plastic bags, we feed them, and they thrive.
I went to The Sims, and it was fabulous. It was really worthwhile. I don't understand in terms of the private, when they collect the garbage, the government, doesn't it get involved somehow? Because where it gets dumped, also the industrial waste, where does that go?
Yes, there are many regulations that the privates must follow that are from local, state, and federal government agencies. So the privates are not, unbridled cowboys just marauding around the city. The regulations for the city are different and tighter. The work conditions are also safer for city workers than for private carters on the whole. In terms of industrial waste, everywhere that garbage is dumped is only done so according to specific permits granted by federal and state and city agencies. And there are some forms of waste that cannot go where household waste goes. For example, you see up here it's called construction and demolition waste. C&D is the shorthand for that. if you want to collect C&D and then take it to, let's say, a transfer station where you would dump it into a barge and then it's tugged to some final resting place, that transfer station has an entirely different set of regulatory requirements and permit requirements than what household waste requires. So I don't have in my head a sort of map of transfer stations and truck-based, like marine or truck-based or rail-based transfer stations that are specifically for industrial wastes, but we have them in a few different neighborhoods, mostly in Brooklyn and Queens along the Newtown Creek. Who owns the land? The private company generally owns the land. But that's a broad statement, and I would have to go and look at each one and see who owns what. And I think, are we almost out of time, Karen? I see paper going back and forth, so a little bit longer? Okay, a few more questions, all right. So there's a woman with white hair right there who's, yes, you.
I actually have the mic.
Oh, sorry,
so.
sorry, behind you, didn't see you, go ahead.
Thank you. I actually have a question about you.
Okay.
Did you start working for the sanitation department while you were getting your PhD?
No.
Or after?
After.
What's the chronological order of this past?
Oh, which part? I was born in...
No. The sanitation
part.
Driving the broom.
Operating the broom.
Operating the mechanical broom.
Very good. This is chapter 2, just so you know. But just in a nutshell, from the time I was a kid, I was very perplexed about garbage, where we generate it, where we leave it, and who we assume is going to clean up after us. That central question, who picks up after us, has been a part of my way of seeing the world since I was about 10 or 11. And anywhere I've ever traveled for whatever reason, I want to know that. In graduate school, it never occurred to me that I could make that a central research question, because who looks at garbage? I was like, So I did other things, and that was fine, and it was very rewarding, and that was fine. My first book was called Claiming the Virgin, all about liberation theology in Northeast Brazil. But at around that time, I heard Meryl Euclides give a talk. And here was someone who was passionate about exactly those questions of who picks up after us. Why is it important to know that? Why is it important to shed light on the people who do that labor and to recognize the essential role they play in the city's well-being? And she's a girl. So she, for me, was a role model. I graduated Columbia, I started teaching at NYU, and I approached a colleague who ran, at the time, an interdisciplinary graduate program, and I said, let me teach something for you. He said, okay, what do you got? And I proposed a bunch of different topics, and everyone, he said, no, we have people who do that. No, we have people who do this. No, we have people, no. And then finally he said, what's your dream class? I said, oh, that's easy, garbage. And he said, good, get me a syllabus. So that became a class I still teach called Garbage in Gotham, the Anthropology of Trash. And I met a sanitation worker and invited him as a guest speaker. But the more I learned about the nuts and bolts of the infrastructure and the system and the people, the more I realized as an anthropologist, I can't speak of any of that without actually knowing it. So I asked for permission to do research. That went nowhere for a long time. And I finally got a foot in the door and started to accompany crews on their routes and learn what it was at different jobs and ranks and locations. And I realized I still didn't know enough because it wasn't my responsibility. None of it rested on my shoulders. I didn't know what it was to wear the uniform as my own, or to pilot the truck, or to get lost plowing snow, or to block the main entrance of the Bronx Zoo with your truck in the middle of a snowstorm because you're so lost and think you've found a cul-de-sac where you can gather your wits, except then the woman comes out going, and then you back up without a guide person, which you're not supposed to do, but you can't ask a civilian to do that because then, and so you back up, and you leave these gullies of tire tracks in the soft grass outside the main entrance of the Bronx Zoo. Long ago, it's healed now, I'm sure, but anyway, so that was the journey, and that took years. Luckily, I was no longer in graduate school, and I didn't have the pressure of like, you gotta finish, right? Because it wouldn't have worked as a dissertation project. But I get to do it as long as I want now, which is also just a deep, deep pleasure. Yes, sir. Oh, no, wait. You know what? I'm going to let you choose because you're over there and you know who's actually got their... Okay.
I've read your book, actually. It was very entertaining.
Thank you.
But one thing I took away from it was the physical wear and tear
Oh, yeah.
on the workers. And you mentioned one man who worked 34 years, you
Yeah.
said. How does anybody manage that? And then how did you do it?
I didn't do it very long, a few months only, and when you're hired now, when I was hired, it was a 20-year pension. After you're on the job for 20 years, you get a full pension. Now it's 22 years, and when people say, how long were you on, I say, well, imagine the 22 years is an hour. I was on for a few minutes. For someone like Nelson Molina, who worked for 34 years, he himself is extremely physically fit. He runs marathons and does triathlons and is very, very aware of his physical well-being and threats to it. He didn't intend to retire last April of 2015, but something twinged in his back. And he quite wisely said, okay, I'm only in my early 60s. I am healthy and my kids are all grown and life is good and I'm not going to risk somehow becoming incapacitated by staying on this job when my body is telling me, step out. The injuries that sanitation workers suffer are everything from, this was fascinating to me when I first learned this. When you're moving between parked cars, they're often quite close together. This was in the book. License plates often get dented and dinged, and their edges are very sharp. And when you're moving quickly, you're gonna lacerate your shins on these license plate edges. Who would have thought of that, right? So that's not necessarily fatal, although if you haven't had a tetanus shot recently and don't take care. But then there's stuff that comes flying out of the truck at you, and then there is the wear and tear on rotator cuffs and hips and lower back. Whenever the city pushes the union to extend routes, the union pushes back and says, quite rightly, my members, this is Harry Nespoli, the president right now of Local 831, my members' bodies will not sustain that. And I will not support a route extension. I mean, this is not, it depends on the specific context of the route extension, but you want to be very careful and you want to pay very close attention when you do get those twinges. For myself, there's a chapter in the book in the second person. You are in the truck, you are working, and I describe you never knew your back could contort in quite that way. You can't lie flat anymore. That was me. So I'm okay now, but lift with your leg. I mean, there's all kinds of tricks, but it's gonna take a toll. It's gonna take a toll, especially in heavy districts. The Bronx, you're gonna carry your share of 20 tons in a shift, 10 tons a day. In fact, they used to have a 100-ton club. If you and your partner had a 20-ton day, 5 days out of 6, you were in the 100-ton club. The garage that invented that was nicknamed the House of Pain. One more. One more? One more. You choose. There is a reception after. I'm not going anywhere, so we can still talk.
This is a quick question. What is special waste?
Special waste.
Yes.
Special waste is anything that doesn't fit into those three very broad categories. If this were, this is a cartoon from a remarkable woman named Annie Leonard, who has a series of short animated documentary videos and also a book called The Story of Stuff. Highly recommend it. Medical waste, mining waste, agricultural waste, various forms of industrial waste that are not necessarily in the big pile of industrial, nuclear waste. One of the perpetual dilemmas of studying and trying to deal with questions of waste is exactly this issue of definition, because definition then defines regulation. So what you call it is going to have a direct impact of how much the government says you have to be careful or not. And on that provocative statement, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Robin, can I take advantage of having the microphone to ask you one question? What is now your role as anthropologist in residence? You're obviously ambassador and advocate.
Ambassador and advocate, yes, always. And that's about translating what they do to you, so you recognize how important they are, but also translating their importance to them. I give a talk about the history, and I show those before and after photographs to new hires. And I've had people who've now been on the job for a while who are promoted up the ranks who come to me and tell me it made a big difference in understanding, okay, if someone says, well, you're a garbage man. Yeah, no. I'm the one who keeps you alive. I'm the one who keeps your city alive. I said that I wanted you all to remember the mechanical broom, the proper title. That was one of 2 takeaways. Thank you for your question, Karen, because the other takeaway is, which I forgot to mention, next time you see a sanitation worker, thank them.
Yeah.
And my other big role is this project with Nelson Molina with the collection at the Manhattan 11 garage. The garage is moving. They're not taking all that stuff with them. So what do we do with it? That'll be part of the museum, which has been sort of a project in play for a little while. But so that's my primary role right now, those 2 things.
Thank you. Robin, on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, I want to thank you so much for, to say fascinating would be an understatement. Your passion, I think we're all going to think about the sanitation department in a completely different way. You have achieved your aim this evening, but thank you for highlighting, as it is, it's the army of the city that is vital to the running of the city, and you have drawn our attention to it in the most eloquent way, and we are very grateful to you being part of our lecture series, so thank you so much. Thank you. Right. And Robin, on occasions like this, we like to make a presentation. And to do this, a citation is our executive director, Victoria Dangle.
And Robin, and I just want to add to Karen's comments, I mean, spectacular. So much that goes on here with our lectures. I always say we look at things in a way we have never looked at them before, and for the future, that will be so when it comes to the sanitation department. And you jogged a memory of when I had just got into my first year of college, and it was a sanitation man who climbed, I lived in Inwood, and he climbed 4 flights to return a little academic planner that he had found and knew to return it, and he saw apartment 4J, and he said, "Are you Victoria?" And there he came upstairs, yes. But I had forgotten about that. So thank you. And on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, founded 1785, we express our gratitude to Robin Nagle, Anthropologist-in-Residence for the New York City Department of Sanitation and author of Picking Up on the Streets and Behind the Trucks with the Sanitation Workers of New York City, for your participation in the Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And Robin, and again, and our audience knows, our regulars know that we never let anyone go that has lectured, so we have made you an honorary lifetime member of the library. Wow. Come back. I will. Okay? Wow. Thank you.
This is the best. Wow. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for all of it.
And Meg Stanton, our program coordinator and registrar, will present you with your poster.
A little memento.
Such bounty.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.